My name's Scotty Ray, and I am the head of solutions engineering for Cloudflare US Public Sector, which is probably the longest, craziest title ever. So let me just simplify this. I have the privilege to serve a team of women and men that are singularly focused on one mission, and that's to help build a better internet. Now, for us in the public sector space, we mean that that's not just for commercial entities, for industry, but also for our government space on both federal, state and local, higher education, et cetera. What I want to talk about a little bit today is just take a little bit of a retrospect. We can talk all about the pillars. We all know the pillars. We can talk about the acceleration. I think we're all pretty familiar in this room with the table stakes. But I think it's important to take a retrospective look at what we've seen over the past 10 to 12 years. 12 to 14 years ago, I would argue, was really where the beginning of the dissolution of the perimeter occurred. Applications started moving out to clouds because, well, that was the cool thing. Somebody read it in a magazine on the back of an airplane, and yeah, we've got to move to a cloud. And there were some really good reasons to do that. Maybe we're finding out some challenges in also doing that. And then we saw workers, for whatever, there was that little thing that happened about 4 years ago that sort of changed the way in which we looked at the remote workforce. And now that's even changing in terms of returning back to sort of pre-pandemic environments. But what we saw was industry's response in terms of how we deliver capabilities such as SASE, SSE, identity, and the other things that make up this goal of defining and embracing a zero trust framework. For the federal space, we saw a choice that said, we're not going to play because the rigor is just too much for me to do. I'm not going to see the return on investment. And literally there were some in industry that just walked away. There were others that, when we talk about the cloud-delivered elements associated with this, went about the process of building purpose-built federal clouds, which was awesome. Because what it allowed us to do is it allowed us to begin to serve and begin to take the federal marketplace on this journey, but do it with a very intentional eye towards compliance and sort of the other rigors that are needed to service, things like FedRAMP, et cetera. I would argue, though, that in some cases, those architectures that were purpose-built began to recreate some of the same challenges we had pre-cloud. What are those challenges? Locality. If I'm managing and deploying my policy enforcement points at a data center or a handful of data centers, then I still have the fundamental problem of how do I get the traffic and the users and the devices to those endpoints, which creates all kinds of unnatural routing, user experience issues, et cetera. And a lot of times these purpose-built clouds, very limited in terms of the number of points of policy enforcement that they could have, versus, say, their commercial enterprise counterparts. Problem number two was parity. We all see the challenge of when I take a cloud offering, if you will, and I now separate that offering into a commercial and into a federal offering, oftentimes the new cutting edge things that we're deploying in terms of how we're leveraging AI to understand the threat that's being posed by AI, some of those models and some of that data visibility doesn't actually make it to some of the government purpose-built organizations or cloud offerings that we have, at least not right away. There's usually some sort of a delay. So when we think about then the threats that were being talked up here in the previous panel, the other aspect of these limited clouds is that they inherently make visibility harder. I would argue, and this is the scary thing, there's certain mission sets, obviously, where we're going to be completely disconnected. No one here is arguing that. There are a lot more mission sets that require us to work in the real world. And in order to work in the real world, we have to have platforms that have visibility to real world threats. This isn't about not just having clouds and policy enforcement points for SASE or SSE or other vendors that are closer to your users. It's important that they're close to the threat. Because the closer I am to the threat, the more data signals that I get, the easier it is for me to build models, to actually leverage machine learning and AI, to respond to machine learning and AI. And if I reduce the visibility, all for a good reason, because I want a purpose-built, federally compliant cloud, I can sometimes limit that visibility, which then limits my knowledge. How do I, make those two opposing things become reality? The way in which you do that is we take a look at providers that take an architectural approach whereby data planes and control planes can be separated. Where control planes that contain customer metadata, logging, the administrative functions, et cetera, those can be very compliant from a federal space, from a rigor perspective, but leverage a commercial data plane that's truly global in scope so that we can see all of the emerging threats, so that we can respond closer to where those threats begin. This is where I think we can help in some small way, because again, as I think many people have said, it's not one vendor's approach. It's definitely a team, and it's definitely an element of cooperation that has to happen. Back in the original OMB mandate, when they talk about the maturity model, one of the things they talked about with the pillars and those cross-cutting functions is that those pillars are going to mature at different rates, directly proportional to the way in which those cross-cutting functions exist between those pillars, i.e., the more automation we get between identity, data tagging, SASE capabilities, SSE, logging, visibility, and analytics, the more integration that happens, the faster the overall journey can be accomplished. And this is really where a platform approach that is global in width, that is software defined, and allows for a micro modular development. In other words, I can plug in this capability to enhance this particular pillar. I can then, when I'm ready, I can plug in this capability to adapt to this particular pillar. It's those kinds of eating the apple one bite at a time types of an approach that actually will accelerate kind of the old adage, slow is fast. Now, my grandfather was an East Texas Pentecostal preacher, and I promise I'm not going to pass the plate. But what I would like to do is if I could get this slide to advance. One of the things I like to do, we have a table over here. Obviously, we'd love to talk to you. If you look at this QR code, this is actually something we provide out to the cover in terms of the data that goes across our network. Right now, we're in a position where we see about 1 in 5 of every web request out there. And we use that signal intelligence through machine learning and AI to actually develop models to go against threat. You can check it out. There's tons of information there about the threats that we see on a daily basis from a global environment. And we'd love to sit down and talk with you about how do we solve real practical problems incrementally with a global software-defined platform. That's my time. I want to thank everybody for coming, and I hope we all have a great rest of the day.